Hey, what's up, everybody? It's your boy Cypher from Typhon TCG. And thank you guys again for coming to my channel. I just want to also point out, you guys have been giving me feedback these last few videos, and that's all I asked for. I'm glad I could improve for you guys. And this is one of my end of the year Christmas presents to you guys. As you guys can see, I've had a lot of Control Dash on my channel recently, but a lot of people have really not seen this archetype at its bare bones. They've just seen it played on the surface level. But now I'm here to give you guys a comprehensive guide to playing Control Dash. This guide will be accurate as of December 2022. Things are subject to change with new sets and meta shifts. So let's talk about playing Dash Plus Dynasty. Ever since the competitive CCQ has came out with Talishar, I've had about an 80% win rate in the last 40 games with this latest version of the build. And I've been top 3 at my local OGS every single week. Not that that's ground big, and it's not like it's a pro tour every single week, but I've been able to face a variety of decks and pretty good opponents and consistently had success. And I do want to credit Jigaball and TCG Gaming for a lot of the inspiration for this, and they are probably the most well-known players of this archetype outside of myself. So where does the Control Dash go? We have two main plans. We have the gun plan, which I will also be saying the word Exodia. If you guys understand Yu-Gi-Oh, you guys understand the 5 pieces Exodia. I also call that the gun plan. And then part 2, we do have the fatigue, or I also call it passive mill. So what is the gun plan or Exodia? What is this? We play 3 plasma purifiers and 2 induction chambers, which is again Exodia. It's 5 items, 5 pieces of Exodia. And we will be attacking for 12 to 15 damage a turn, depending on how many items we have, without actually losing any cards from our deck. We're able to swing taller than most decks, with losing absolutely 0 cards, which is a big advantage this deck does have. These items are permanent and can only be removed by cards not commonly found in most decks. For example, things like Smashing Good Time and Arc Smash. Active Mill Plan, by forcing opponent to block with multiple cards a turn while seeking land damage, and they will still be rapidly losing cards from their deck. If your opponent's just constantly losing 3 to 4 cards every single turn, not doing anything, that deck size will deteriorate very fast. And this is your late game insurance plan against most control and mid-range decks. What is the fatigue plan? And yes, fatiguing is very well possible with Dash. It's akin to a la Odom. A lot of times we'll be blocking out, keeping a blue to chip in for 4 damage, split into 2 and 2, which in some cases can be better than a hammer. This deck does a lot of times cheat the card count by playing more than 60 cards. If you're trading card for card with every single hero, you actually will come out on top, because a common number we play is 63 or 66. One really good thing about this is most of our cards actually block for 3, so leaking damage is very hard if we block correctly. So if you play MTG or Yu-Gi-Oh, I do have a couple comparisons for this deck to other decks. So let's get into those right now. We have Yu-Gi-Oh, we have Sky Strikers and Mystic Mind Burn are the decks I feel like share a lot of similar properties to this deck. If you've played Sky Strikers, both decks can tend to trade card for card and operate on very low resources, and these can grind out the majority of meta decks of a lot of their power cards. Now, if you've played Mystic Mind Burn, this gives an opponent a clock of a certain amount of turns. If you guys have played cards like Final Countdown, at the end of 20 turns the game will end. It's similar to here. If you don't win in a certain amount of turns, I don't believe you can actually beat Control Dash once they reach it to a certain board state, and this board state can actually prevent the opponent from interacting anymore. If you've played Magic the Gathering, specifically Modern, 4-color control is, I think, an archetype that shows a lot of similar properties. Both decks have a better late game than most. They can turn very low resources into massive gains, and this is akin to snowballing very quickly if they are left unchecked. And one of the biggest things is they can interact with most decks, but also must be interacted with. Control Dash primarily has good matchups across the board, but is susceptible to being high rolled. just like most other decks. I do want to specifically point out, we do talk about how bad of a matchup Fi is. This is specifically talking about the Emberblade build. If your opponent is on Kadachi Fi, shake your opponent's hand and say thank you for the easy win. Primarily patience and being efficient as possible turn to turn, and understanding how to pitch stack effectively in every single matchup will lead you to winning more games. What does this deck teach you? What do we improve on by playing this deck? We will learn how to properly block, play on low econ, working with a blank hero, limit testing, patience, and working with inevitability. Siphon, all this sounds good. Why doesn't Dash always win? Why isn't it the most prevalent deck in the format? I do think this boils down to a few certain points. All of your plays must be correct. There is very little room for error. There are some decks where if you stumble, you can quickly recover. In this deck, it is very unforgiving to make a game-altering mistake. 2, it is very fragile on offense without items. You're not doing very much damage without many items. Most of your attacks are coming in for 2, for 3. You do have some 4s, but again, primarily 2 and 3. This deck can be easily high-road because, again, until we have a lot of items, we're not really stripping cards out of your opponent's hand, so they will have 5-card hands for a large majority of the game. And a game going the distance with your opponent constantly have 5-card hands will akin to you being high road more often than not. This is very bad against go wide decks. If you have a very long Katsu chain of certain breakpoints, it can be very bad. Fi, obviously going super wide, can be very bad. Certain brute turns that have multiple cards with Gogan or multiple extra points can also be bad for this deck. This deck really wants 1 to 2 attacks at max per turn to really be efficient as possible. And honestly, I think probably one of the biggest things for this deck is it just looks boring on the surface. Now, for someone like me, I enjoy playing this deck a lot. I think a lot of the subtle nuances has been one of the greatest things that's happened to me since I've played. I've never played a deck like this in Flesh and Blood where every single matchup is different. Even if the strategy is the same, like block with 3 cards, a lot of heroes reach certain breakpoints certain ways, and figuring out how each deck ticks is absolutely a phenomenal thing to learn and go through. But again, for most people, you're just blocking, loading up some items. Sometimes you don't even shoot them. You're just blocking. Most people don't want to block. That's not what this game was obviously originally intended to do. It was just a bunch of blocking. This was for 2 fighters just to obviously slap each other with silly attacks. And this game is obviously fun that way, but this deck does break the rules of that, and most people can find that boring. If you do want to skip, we do have a timestamp right here. We do have an alignment chart at the end if you want to go straight to it. So let's talk about matchups. As I said earlier, I do believe most of the matchups are favorable if both people are assumed to have the same skill level. Well, obviously, a few specific things can differ to that. So let's go hero by hero and talk about the matchups. We're going to start off with Dash versus Odom. So if you guys look at the link in the description, we will have the deck list posted here so you guys can follow along. So the sideboard plan we're going to have in here when we're on the gun plan versus Odom is going to be taking out 3 CNC, 3 Findle's Fighting Spirit, and 3 Healing Bomb. And some general tips we have in this matchup is you're going to keep your health total very high. It is typical that they will pitch check a lot of dominant attacks for the second cycle, and there will be times where you can take damage and you cannot prevent it. If this means blocking with 2, 3 to 4 cards every single turn to keep your life total high, unless you can set up an item, then so be it. You will be breaking the chain very often when you're going for your big combo turns. This will allow Odin to block with Rampart to mitigate a lot of damage. Rampart is one of the biggest annoyances in this matchup. Because we're playing a lot of Directs, cards like CNC shut that down a lot. Pummel is also a card that must be played around or you will get severely punished. Unless you can develop your board, do not use equipment to mitigate damage. This is a losing strategy, because when you're going to need it late game, you will not have it, and second and third cycles really where the nitty gritty and the game winning decisions do happen. You want to prioritize getting a direct and arsenal again to mitigate a lot of damage. This is going to be a common occurrence through a lot of matchups. Do not arsenal anything other than a direct or an item or instant, because it may get stuck in there if you're forced to block with a lot of cards in your hand and you lose a ton of value. Pitching D-Rex early will allow you to block late game damage and keep cards. You do want to be very aggressive. Late game, once you assemble Exodia, you can leak damage every single turn and sometimes still get their whole entire hand. Both are good. Talking about Dash versus Finals is unfortunately your worst matchup. We're going to go into the Fatigue plan. We're going to be taking out 3 Unmovable, 3 Plasma Purifiers, 1 Induction Chamber, 1 Heartifying Dough. One key thing you will see is this. On the Fatigue plan, there are some matchups where we will be playing 1 Chamber, there will be some playing 2. A lot of times, the only time we're playing 1 is if we can't afford to have a no block in our hand, or if the extra 2 damage doesn't actually change the matchup. Again, as I was just saying, this is your hardest matchup, so if you do win this, honestly, I do want to say this is very respectable. It is hard for even a very seasoned Dash player to be a mediocre Fi, just because of how the deck's strategies do line up. Tunic is primarily used for Oasis Respite. If you use a card to pay for Oasis, it is not a very successful strategy. The only time I would use this without using a Tunic would be if you're also planning on blocking with your equipment, your Iron Hides. Because it can actually offer a lot of cushion. That's 8 damage for a blue that you can soak up. But outside of that very specific situation, it is a losing strategy to use a card to block with Oasis Respite. Now, yes, while they cannot interact with the gun plan, again, as I said earlier, having no blocks in your hand versus Fi is very dangerous, and they can allow Snowball. You will actually leak damage the large majority of the game. They are not going to block your 4 damage, primarily at any point, unless they are a very slower, gradual building Fi. When they're at sub 15 life, and they don't have a lot of power cards left in their deck, you can actually swing your pistol for 2, then swing for 4 for 6 damage to actually start putting on pressure and threatening to kill them. This is something that actually does increase your winning percentage by a lot. This is something I actually had to learn. Do lots of trial and error and just losing. Small interactions like this will also, again, increase your win rate. If you have a life gain card in your hand, I would be totally fine with blocking with everything else in your hand. Take a turn off from loading items or even attacking with anything. Just game 3 a lot of times can make or break the game. You do want to try to read how your 5 players pitch stacking. If they're very lazy, and by very lazy I mean if they're just pitching a lot of blues early and they're not like on a little build trying to shuffle that deck, this is very good for you. This means their late game damage output will be severely nerfed, and this is absolutely perfect for you. You can use this time to actually block a lot of their high impact turns, like their auto war turns or spreading flames turns, and this can keep you into the second cycle having a very, very high life total. Talking about Dash versus Icelander, probably one of the best matchups that you can have. This is one of the few, I'd say 2 or 3 matchups that will really check your skill as a Dash pilot. We will be on the gun plan for this one, and the sideboard plan we're going to be doing is -3 Sink Below, -3 Favorite Scene, -3 Immovable, -3 CNC. Some of you guys might look at the CNC and going into Icelander and wonder why we're not playing it. One thing, it is a red, which is already bad against a very arcane heavy focus deck, and having multiple blues with the gun plan is more applicable. Number 2 is if we are threatening their arsenal, depending on what it is, they can always just remove that card from the arsenal under their own will. And unless it's an Icy Eternal at a very disadvantageous point, it doesn't actually accomplish much in the matchup. The sideboard plan is actually for Temple Icelander, even though the Bulllander build is gaining lots of popularity and is what the top player in the world uses currently. Until it has high representation, I don't see any reason to change the sideboard plan, but if it does gain popularity, I will change as needed. Probably the biggest thing you can do in this matchup is keep track of the minimum amount of mana you can do to attack correctly. Rarely will you get to use all your items and all the mana that you get to see in your hand initially. Some of that mana will be choked up in blocking arcane damage and removing frostbites. So keep in mind how much you need to be able to do things successfully. If you can't do the full extent of your board, see what is safe. Is it just put a counter on pistol, shoot pistol, give it go again, shoot? Can you actually afford to put counters in purifiers, remove counters, and attack more? That is something that's going to have to judge and will come with a lot of games, so know your limits. If they are trying to attack you physically, use this time to get some of the reds out of your hand. So you can actually have a lot of blues in the second cycle. Keep in mind the power cards that they have went through. Check their graveyard very frequently. Things like Red Aether Ice Vein, see and see if they play it. Icy Charl and Insidious Chills are cards you really want to look for. And they play 3 of all of these. If they coordinate speak you, do not use Tunic, just eat the card loss. There is a very small opportunity for you to use a card. It is if you have a card like Oasis Respite in your hand, you can use the Tunic for it, so you're not actually losing a card. But more often times than not, I wouldn't mind just pitching the card. I don't think it changes most of your turns. As I said, this is a favorable matchup for you, but it comes down to skill and resource management, which is why I think it actually is more of a 50-50 than how the matchups usually actually play out. Talking about 5 versus Vista right now. This is one of the first matchups where I do kind of go back and forth. So currently I am on the fatigue plan against this, but I have found the gun plan does work, but the fatigue plan has worked a little more consistently. This is a matchup where we're going to do -3 in purifiers, -3 immovable. As we don't get punished for not having all cards in our hand that are blocked, we can play things like the second chamber, the Heart of Findel, and the Remembrance because they also help with our main game plan. There is a limited OTK version of Viscerai being tested out, and if it does become popular, I do think we go into the gun plan because they do have the ability to OTK us, even if we do have a largely blue hand. If they do start stacking their enchants, you need to be aggressive and get cards out of their hand, as I was stating earlier. They have multiple cards that go again. They can stack upwards of 2 to 6 enchants a turn. And when they get to 30 to 40 enchants and they come with like a 9th Blade or an Arcanine Ascendancy, it does spell large amounts of trouble for us. And because we're not actually putting pressure on with our primarily gun plan, they can stack these without much pressure. Getting reds out of your hand at all costs, you cannot afford them have them versus Viscerai. So if you do have to play some type of generic turn that is not akin to your normal play patterns, I do suggest you do so, again, to get the reds out of your hand. Do not let Marvin Skies hit under any circumstance. You will lose too much HP that is pretty much free. Now, what I mean by free is the only on-hit effect is the enchant, right? And it's 1 to 3. But a lot of times, this 1 to 3 damage can matter a lot since you're not putting pressure on your opponent. There's a lot of times you will get to the low teens if they are consistently having these far guard hands, which again, you're not really going to be able to disrupt that. And if they have like a big Morgitide turn, you can expect to take 20 damage even pitching A, B, and blocking. So the extra little chip damage from the extra enchants being hit here, I do think matter a lot. I would obviously pitch to A, B before you think about blocking, as you are a fatigue deck. Keeping cards in your deck is better than losing cards from your deck. Talking about Dash versus Dromai, another interesting matchup, one of the other skill check decks versus Dash. We're going to be on the gun plan for this one, and our sideboard will be taking out 3 Oasis Respites and 3 Immovable. I do want to thank TCG Gaming for the Brutal Assault tech, and the method of how we play a lot of the turns actually came from the way they attack this matchup. You do want to prioritize killing dragons above all else. You cannot sustain against multiple dragon attacks every single turn, as you will get flooded and lose the game. The usage of poppers does vary from game to game. If you can actually pop a dragon, develop an item, or clear a board, you can do so. If you cannot do that, save it for the second cycle, especially if there are playing things like Remembrance or pitching the Legendary Dragons earlier, or pitching Maraudais earlier. You do want to be able to match cards like that and get rid of the cards. Now, I do go back and forth, bring in AB versus Dromai. With the amount of life gain we have in the deck, I don't know if it's 100% necessary, but I currently am still bringing AB1. But this is subject to change. Dragons that we do want to look out for is Uvia. Uvi is a constant valve of pressure because they're going to consistently be able to get Ash. Dromais have gotten good enough to where after like turn 3, turn 4, they're going to have an abundance of Ash. And being able to get a free Aether Wing every single turn, that comes for one, spells out to a lot of incremental advantage over the course of the game. Vincerikai is 9 damage split into 6 and 3, and split damage is not something that we take very well. So being able to block this out and kill it on the following turn is preferable. Kyloria, we're an item deck. I don't really need to explain Kyloria. Now, there have been multiple games where, unfortunately, I blocked incorrectly, and if the dash player is not smart and the drumline notices this, they'll save the Kyloria for the end of the chain to try to nab one of those items. And obviously, just sometimes one item being gone can make the game impossible to win. Chromai is a monster. It can play around a lot of poppers by gaining extra action points and just allow for certain plays that otherwise wouldn't be possible due to the extra theoretical go again. Now we have a dash versus dash mirror. Now we will talk about all three versions, but I do assume the most common version will be the aggro version. So for this into every single plan, we just assume that they're probably going to be hybrid. We're going to take out 2 immobile, 3 healing bombs, 3 oasis respites, and 1 remembrance. If one version of the deck does get more popular, we can obviously alter the sideboard. If your opponent's an aggro dash, I do believe this is a very favorable matchup. If your opponent's on hybrid dash, I do believe it is a skill base, and if it's control dash, I'm sorry for both of you. You guys are going to have a fun game, and by fun game, I mean awful game. If you're versus hybrid or control, you're going to use your whispers and sift to find extra items and establish them. In both of these matchups, it is whoever establishes items and tempo first usually will win the game. If you're versus boost dash, matching them card for card and keeping a blue chip F4, they will not block it, and they will actually lose a large majority of their deck just by trying to play the game. A lot of times they're losing 2 cards just to attack for a thing that's going to get blocked, and then you're still chipping for damage. It's largely a favorable trade for you. Now we're going to talk about both ranges versus dash. I do believe both of these will play very similar, not in game plan. Obviously, one is trying to dominate and get detrimental effects, one is trying to tax you. But I do think the way they set these things up are similar enough to where we can attack them the exact same way. We're going to be in the gun plan for both of these. Our sideboard plan is going to be -1 remembrance, -3 healing bomb, -3 Findle's Flying Spear, and -3 Sigil of Solace. CNC is the best card for this matchup and is a surefire way to get tempo back because one or two things are going to happen. You're going to take 2 cards from them, they're going to be down from a 6-card hand to a 4-card hand. And their 4-card hand is different from most decks' 4-card hand, and I definitely think we edge out there. Alternatively, if this for some reason does hit, they're not losing 2 cards in their arsenal, and having massive turns with 5 and 6-card hands is how they usually beat most decks. Specifically talking about Lexi, and with Azalea, this really stops like very efficient multiple arrow turns, or if they've been set up a specific arrow and have a lot of buffs in hand, this does stop that as well. With the Dynasty release, I do want to note the Azalea matchup has gone a slight bit harder, but it is still largely favorable. But it is a matchup I am going to keep my eye out on. Some of the arrows to keep in mind is going to be Bolt and Shot, Endless Arrow, Heat Seeker, and Red in the Ledger. What all these cards have in common is they either give advantage, block out. So for example, the reason why Red in the Ledger gives this example, and not like the other 3, like I just explained, is what Red in the Ledger does. It gives card advantage by removing cards that would otherwise be taken from their hand, if this makes sense. So let's say you have Exodia out, and you get hit by a Dominated Red in the Ledger. So from where you would have been hit for 15 that turn, now they're going to hit for 2. Because nothing you do is an instant, everything has go again, it shuts down go again. So theoretically they are actually keeping more cards than they would have, and this can lead to a massive snowball if they just get 1 turn pretty much uncontested. You can naturally fatigue both these rangers being on the gun plan by not shooting, due to the amount of cards they have to use per turn. In most decks, the gun plan is aiming to get multiple cards out of their hand, so on their turn they don't have much of an offense, but due to the amount of arrows they actually have less power cards in their deck than the average deck. If they do pitch a lot of blues early, this is your big chance to block out early, keep your left total high, is they will have low damage in that 2nd, 3rd cycle in the late game. Talking about Dash versus Briar now. This is one of the most unique matchups. We're going to be running 69 cards in this. I was very hesitant against this until I tried it out, and I do think the extra cards in this one does actually matter a lot due to the amount of threats they have in their deck. The only 3 cards we're actually taking out is going to be 3 Plasma Purifiers. They do have to run a lot of bad cards in their deck to support their CMH. Use this advantage in their second cycle when they run into a lot of blues, yellows, and cards that are very inefficient to putting on any pressure. When they're about sub 20, this is your chance, just like Vi, to start mixing in pistol shots and regular attacks to start stripping cards on their hand and pressure them. If they are on a high arcane damage build, which is not common, but if they are on a high arcane damage build, they actually peter out very fast. You want to cycle some of your D-Rex in for the second cycle to match their pitch stack. If they pitch a CMH for late game, you pitch a D-React to match it. Examples like that. Dash versus Bravo, I think this is probably the biggest skill check as a Dash player. I would honestly say this is the matchup I've probably played against the most. And this isn't the hardest matchup, I would say, like matchup-wise. It is just the hardest matchup decision-wise. Decision from turn to turn. What am I doing? Because I don't think there's a single turn where you can mess up and win. Even though I did say this deck is very unforgiving, I do think you can make very minor errors and still win. But blocking with a regular card sometimes is actually better than a D-React, even if it would cover up and you would leak some damage. Sometimes just actually taking the damage is better. And there's so many intricacies to this matchup, it's kind of hard to talk about one video. The sideboard plan we're currently using is going to be -3 Fyndal's Fighting Spirits, -1 Heart of Findo. CNC and Pummel are 2 cards that this deck will play that will absolutely ruin your hopes and dreams of having fun. One of their big power turns against us is Rousing the Ancients into Hammer or even another attack. Another one is Dominate Crippling Crush when we have no arsenal. These can be very game-winning plays if they're able to do this in the first, and especially in the second cycle. If they're able to accomplish stuff like this in the second cycle, and you do not pitch stack properly and have enough cards to fight against cards like this, I do think there is no way you can win. Timing equipment blocks is very key to winning this matchup. A lot of times people just are like, well, that's 12 damage. I need to block that. I'll even use equipment. When a lot of times that 12 damage can just be covered up with 3 cards and you can chip back in for 4. But whenever it's 9 damage, no go again, that's really when you might actually want to use your equipment. But if you use your equipment just on some vanilla damage that actually didn't matter, you're going to be missing out for when it does matter. As I said earlier, do not use all your D-Rex early. They will try to kill you in your second cycle. If you ever die first cycle to a Bravo, something severely wrong has happened, and you most likely got high road and you did not play the matchup correctly. While most of the crushes do not matter, the force damage they can do does in the second cycle. You will play the majority of the game on the back foot due to the high velocity of their first cycle. If you do have an item in your hand, be careful with how you block it. If you're left with an item and they pummel you, that can be game ending on the spot because you do need to assemble Exodia very, very quickly. One of the most stressful matchups in the whole entire game, I think, for any hero. As I said earlier, this will be a big test of your skill as a pilot of Control Dash. Dash versus Levia. We are on the fatigue plan here. And the game plan we're going to be doing is -3 Plasma Purifier, -1 Remembrance. Things you want to look out for is a big Art of War turn to extend their plays, Dredge Screamers to also extend their plays. This allows way more damage and it's pretty rough if not taken lightly. Probably one of the best combos you can ever see in there is going to be a Dread into a Grappling. That's going to be 13 damage for 2 cards, which is legit. Swing turn 0 is something we do against a lot of decks, not because we're aiming to do damage, we're actually aiming to remove cards from their deck for free. Most decks don't actually understand that. That's what the goal is. But against this deck, that's not something you actually want to do. They want to fill their graveyard, so they will block happily, no matter what it is. They will sometimes block with multiple cards, even if it's just a pistol for 2, just to get cards in the graveyard. If they are on the recursion engine, so that does mean Half-Millions and Ghostly Visits, they can easily fuel this back up almost every turn, if not every other turn, and extend very highly if they do have a good roll on Scab Skins. Arc Smash, and this also goes for Brute, is a card they will find room for if Dash does become more prevalent, so you need to be lookout for that item. You do have the late game Insurance versus Levia. You do need her to have a bad turn, but if she just has a bad turn, she will kill herself or get to the point where you will have advantage for the rest of the game. It is openly harder with the Fatigue plan to ship cards from their hand, but if you're able to slowly chip in and she chooses to block, maybe that one card is what she needed to actually have a good turn. But again, this is also another matchup where you can mix in those pistol shots and then 4 damages to put some extra pressure on. Dash versus Rhinar. We are going to be on the gun plan for this one. We're going to have -3 Healing Bombs, -3 Finless Fighting Spirit. Rhinar can be a very hard matchup for you because of the damage he can force on you. Turn 0, you're almost guaranteed to take damage if he goes first. He can strip multiple cards out of your hand and start with a big life expectancy. So this is something that can really be hard to make it up for. So try to go first if possible. Blood Rush Bells is another thing that can make a big life gap. They're going to come with so much damage and also being able to strip cards in your hand. There's just damage sometimes in this matchup you're not actually able to prevent. Arc Smash is another big item to look out for. If again, Brutes are wary of Dash and Dash has become more prevalent, this will be a card they do play 3 of and they will re-roll their Gambler's Gloves if need be. A lot of runner damage actually comes from browsing beatdowns. It's free Intimidate and forces the opponent to either block with 2 non-equipments and take some of the damage, or flat out take a boosted attack from them. It's even better if it's any brute attack and it's not just attacks. This means their weapon. Their weapon is also affected by beatdown, so this can become a lot of efficient plays. Do not get less than 2 life, or Reckless Swing is a thing that can kill you. This damage is unblockable and can only be countered, quote unquote, by life gain or Oasis Respite, which if you're using that on your turn, I do think you're losing the game. Talking about Dash versus Drenthia, another very fun skill check matchup. I am currently on the Fatigue plan for this one, and our sideboard plan will be -3 Healing Bombs, -1 Induction Chamber, -3 Plasma Purifier, -3 Sigil of Solace, -1 Remembrance, -1 Heart of Findo. Honestly, this is a game plan I've tried both ways, and I've had success. Right now, I can't decide what is better for the long term. Currently, I am on the Fatigue plan, but if you do choose the gun plan, this is actually a matchup where you want to use DRX very aggressively in that first cycle. Dora cannot interact with your gun plan and does fold very quickly, but with that same point, sometimes having 1 no block in your hand could ruin your game. I have experimented with keeping Remembrance in the deck for now. I am keeping it out. There has been a lot of times with if I have to block a certain way, I am low on cards and Remembrance has helped out, but I don't think it's helped out enough to warrant a spot in the deck. CNC is one of the best cards from this matchup. Dory relies on the arsenal, kind of secretly. A lot of people don't understand how much Dory does rely on the arsenal. I think CNC is one of the big ways to attack that. A lot of times you actually just remove 2 cards from their hand. They're generally not going to let this hit unless they have a very specific hand that the arsenal was just luxury. Obviously, if you're not on the gun plan, you're on the Fatigue. Pitch your DRX for second cycle. This has been a common thing with a lot of these matchups. And keep your life total very high. If you can sense they have key reprise cards that matter to their combo, do not block. This sense will come with a lot of time and understanding what reprise cards matter with certain hands. There will be a lot of times in the game where you will just block out a Dawn Blade. You will overblock with that Dawn Blade, even if it's coming in for 6. You need to guarantee that all counters get removed. A Dawn Blade that has 3 counters a lot of times will become unblockable for the rest of the game. There's going to be Dash versus Bolton, and we specifically are talking about switch and combo Bolton. If your opponent's playing strictly Raiden Bolton, shake your opponent's hand and say thank you for the win. For this, we're going to be on the gun plan, This matchup, we're taking out 3 movable and taking out 3 Findle's Fighting Spirits. This is a matchup by keeping your life total very, very high to combat the combo turn for Bolton. If you can establish multiple items, switch to being very aggressive and stripping cards out of their hand. Most of the cards in your deck will pump their cards, so leaking damage is very likely if you do block poorly. Their combo will naturally remove a large amount of their deck, so the amount of work you need to do to fatigue them is less than the average deck. Dash versus Kano. In this matchup, we're taking about all the reds we can afford to take out and any D-React. I do believe this matchup is very simple if you have knowledge with how to combat Wizard. Their goal is to have you lose cards out on their turn, so you cannot mount offense on your turn, and with low cards in hand, you cannot stop what their arcane damage is doing. You do have life gain in your deck to hedge against a lot of this arcane damage that they're doing, but we also are running a lot of blues and AB4 to block most of this arcane damage that they're presenting. They will rarely block you, so being able to chip in for damage very early is going to be simple. And if you assemble Exodia, one Exodia turn is technically half of their starting life total, which they can't really survive one Exodia turn. If they take a full Exodia turn, I do believe the game is over. When Exodia is assembled, it might be fun to spend all your resources on your items, but this is sloppy play against them, and this will a lot of times lead towards death. Testing the waters with loading certain items and attacking with certain items is your best strategy. Because if you're only left with 2 resources in your hand, if you expended every other card in your hand, they could just kill you if you're at a certain life total. So that kind of goes back to the first point of keeping your life total high. The higher your life total, the more sloppy you actually can play, but obviously I would always try to play as precise as possible against Kano. Dash versus Arachne. Currently my sideboard plan is going to be -2 Command and Conquer, -3 Healing Bomb, -3 Findle's Flying Spirit, -1 Remembrance, and we will be on the gun plan. Honestly, I don't actually have the games I would like against Arachne. I don't think enough people play it at a high enough level for me to get consistent practice. While I haven't lost a game, I don't know if this is just a good matchup for me, if I have a higher power level, or is just my experience with the deck and their lack of experience against the deck shining there. Hopefully we do get more people playing the deck so we have a better outlook against this deck. So that's going to be our matchups. Let's talk about some Dash fundamentals. We're going to talk about some math for items. We're going to start off with 1 item and a single blue in hand. So we're going to do pistol for 4. And what we can do here is we can pitch a blue, load both items, shoot pistol, give it go again, put a counter back on pistol, shoot again for a total of 4 damage for a single blue. Now if we already had a counter on one of the items, this is even better. This allows us to have a yellow and do the same thing. But with a blue, this can always keep us with a single blue or yellow, allow us to do both of them, and we don't have to worry about using multiple cards. And if we for some reason do have multiple reds in hand, we can still actually play the game. Calming one item with an attack. This is something that we talked about earlier. Something that we can do here to kill bigger dragons to put extra pressure on our opponent. So we can pitch Sigil Solus to put a counter on our pistol. We can shoot our pistol for 2, give it go again. Then we can pitch Overloop to attack for a Brutal Assault for 6 damage. This will kill Uvia, which is the highest health dragon we have outside of Necria, but Necria dies in the same exact way, but in a very weird reason, because that's how Necria specifically works. But again, this also does put a little more extra pressure on our opponent with only 1 item. Going on to 2 item math, we're going to have a Purifier and then Chamber Out, and we're going to have 2 blues in our hand. What we can do is we're going to pitch a blue to add a counter to all of our items. We can activate Purifier, pitch a blue, put a counter on our Purifier. We can shoot pistol for 3 to give it go again. Put a counter on our pistol, and then put a counter on chamber. Shoot pistol for 3. You will end the turn with 2 of your items having counters on them, and you have swung for 6 damage. And a common thing what we see here is if we can already have counters on items going into our next turn, this makes our next turn even easier, and we don't have to have as many blues in our hand as we normally would. Part 2, if we have 2 chambers, it's fairly simple, just like the last one. We can pitch a blue, add a counter to all of our items, activate pistol, shoot pistol for 2, give it go again. Put a counter on pistol and a counter on chamber, shoot pistol for 2, give it go again. Put a counter on pistol, shoot for 2, and you end the turn with one of your items having a counter on it. And again, you have swung for 6 damage. Part 3. If for some weird reason you only have 2 purifiers out, I'm sorry, first of all. But here you can pitch a blue, put a counter on all of our items, activate both purifiers, pitch a blue, put a counter on both purifiers, shoot pistol for 4. And again, this is without losing any cards from our hand. Playing around Ice React from Odom, you can use a blue to load all of our items. If you already have an item loaded, you can still activate it. It just won't gain a counter, but it will use the resource. This is important for getting extra cards out of your hand to stop their Ice React. You can activate purifiers, pitch a blue, and put a counter on it. They no longer can Ice React you. Use this concept with other combinations of items and mana to play around Ice React. 3 item math. We'll have 1 purifier and 2 chambers. And we're going to have 2 blues in our hand, being blue overloops. You can pitch a blue, load a counter on chamber and purifiers, pitch a blue, add a counter to pistol, you have 2 floating, activate purifier. Shoot pistol for 3, give it go again, put a counter on pistol, 1 floating. Shoot pistol for 3, give it go again, put a counter on pistol, shoot pistol for 3, and that's going to be 9 damage for 2 cards. And again, you have not lost a single card from your deck. They're going right back to your deck. And any extra mana you have can just be lent to putting counters on items for a following turn. Part 2, if you have 2 purifiers and 1 chamber, you can pitch a blue, put counters on your chambers and purifiers. Pitch a blue, put a counter on pistol, you have 2 floating, activate purifiers. You will shoot pistol for 4, give it go again with a pistol, and shoot it again for 8 damage. And just like our last example, any extra cards you have can be counters on other items. And for some sad reason, you have only 3 purifiers out. You can pitch a blue, put a counter on pistol, you have 2 floating, put a counter on your purifiers. Activate purifiers, and then put counters on back on 2 of them. You will shoot for 5 damage. Any extra cards is just extra counters for anything. Going into 4 and 5 item math. If you've been following along, there should be a formula that should be simpler to understand now. So 2 cheats that we do have. If you have a blue, you can shoot pistol a total of 3 times. To load all items and shoot 3 times, you need a minimum of 8 resources. Any higher, just put extra counters on it for the following turn, which can lead to being able to block and still swing out for massive damage. Just the little things. The more reps you have, the more tiny interactions become more obvious, like knowing when to just load items and pass, when to shoot once or twice without purifiers to chip in and save for a bigger turn. Sometimes not activating all purifiers, only activating some, and still shooting multiple times, and the list goes on. Learning the fundamentals of pitch stacking. Pitch stacking D-Rex are used for 2 specific reasons. Number 1, saving them for a second cycle for go tall decks or heavy dominate decks. And 2, removing extra cards from your hand and underpitching to cycle into very specific cards, mainly if you're looking for items or life gain cards. Making a solid pitch stack. What are some of the principles to keep in mind? Number 1 is separating your reds. If at any point in the second cycle you draw multiple reds in your hand, you have handed your opponent tempo back, because now you must block out and not return any damage or return minimal damage with minimal resources to try and muster up offense that will leave you wanting more. Number 2 is you want to try to keep mechanologist cards together for aggressive plays in the hyper late game when the pistol plant is online or viable, or against Stromai in very niche situations. How to use the arsenal properly. Just a heads up, please do not, under any circumstance, put an attack in your arsenal. Do not put anything in your arsenal that's an attack. Don't put an attack in your arsenal. Under any circumstance, that attack in your hand, do not put it in your arsenal. Don't put it in your arsenal. Don't put anything in your arsenal. Do not, under any circumstance, put an attack in your arsenal. The only cards that should ever be put in your arsenal are, number 1, instants. 2, D-Rex. Number 3, items. Number 4, attack action cards. Number 5, anything but number 4. Why is this? Reacting from Arsenal is a way that we can come at high damage turns and keep cards in hand. This also does get around Dominate. There may be points in the game where you're forced to block out with your whole entire hand on defense, leaving a card stuck in Arsenal for many turns. When that massive Dominate attack comes your way, you're out of luck and may be forced to use a card when is disadvantageous or to take damage. The art of blocking. In all games, you can actually break blocking down to a science. You can block with 3 cards, leave a blue in your hand, to shoot back for 4, unless you can develop an item. Knowing how much damage you're willing to take to shoot back varies from game to game. I wish I could tell you a threshold, being like 2, 6, 8, etc. But numbers are different for every hero, and the way they reach that damage is also different, and what that damage means is different. Some hits matter, some don't. Honestly, this is something that you just need to figure out on the fly. So we have our first example here. We have a red Mounting Anger, a Searing Emberblade, a red Blaze Headlong, a red Phoenix Flame, a blue Snatch, and the last card in hand, which I forgot to display, will be any random blue. For example, this is a line from Fio with the single blue in hand where they can swing for 15 damage, threaten a mask a momentum trigger in the middle of the chain, then draw at the end of the chain. So let's say you get 2 cards on the Mounting Anger and a card for the Emberblade. Now you have 2 cards, 1 in hand, 1 in arsenal for the rest of the turn. And you leave yourself to get punished by reactions and anything at the end of the chain like blue Snatch, for example. Now you must choose to block and prevent the on-hits and the damage, or fire back and water down Fi. Neither one of these is great. You want to be the one dictating how you block, not your opponent telling you how to block. Now, I wouldn't blame for people for blocking like this. It does feel correct at a lot of points. And I even still have some of these bad habits against Fi and other aggro decks. But with time, you can notice certain patterns in how they attack and know when combat tricks are coming or when the correct card to block is coming. Now we have another line for Dory. We will be swinging with Dawnblade, and we also will imagine that we have blocked with at least 1 card from hand. Then we have a red Alpha Blood in the reaction step, a yellow Singing Stillblade, finding a Glint the Quicksilver. We will then play the Glint to Quicksilver, drawing Iron Song response. It's going to hit, we're going to activate Dorinthia, we're going to swing Dawnblade, and then play Iron Song response, pitching a blue Alpha Blood and a red Sharpened Steel. A hand like this, assuming you blocked at least any card from hand, threatens 14 damage, and Dawnblade gaining a counter. With 1 less damage coming from Dory, the threat level is way lower. Yes, the counter being semi-permanent can translate into danger later on, but this is actually something you can handle, depending on how many counters are on there. Just like Fi, she is threatened to draw in the middle of the turn, and actually successfully did, but it didn't translate into the same advantage that Fi gains. Not blocking actually would have changed this whole entire Dory with no reprise, and let's actually go right back to that slide. So let's look at the reprise. So the reprises that we triggered was gaining +1 on our next swing, being able to search for a reaction, being able to draw a card from Glint the Quicksilver. Just not blocking on the Singing Stillblade, obviously if we didn't block it with anything, she doesn't find Glint the Quicksilver. Glint the Quicksilver doesn't draw anything else, so she doesn't get go again, and she's just swinging for a little bit of damage, which actually wouldn't have mattered. With these 2 examples, they both had similar damage output, but arrive at it totally different. The ability to dictate when you block is a mighty powerful skill to have. I'm not telling you to never block, but understand how each hero arrives at their damage number is something you need to take note of. So here we have the alignment chart. Again, this is as of December 2022, and the average build that most of these people are doing. Obviously, if they are on certain wacky builds, like, for example, if it's pure Arcane Icelander, I do think the matchup gets a little bit easier for you, but obviously since we're Bowlander, I do think it's a 50-50. If it's Kadachi Fi, it turns into from your hardest matchup to one of your easiest matchups. If it's Lightning Lexi, this turns into more of a 50-50, but obviously they are more glass cannon and easily susceptible to just dying. So Different builds put them different part, but we're putting on the average competitive build that players should be showing up to competitive events with. And I trust this guide raised your skill level when it comes to piling Control Dash. If this is your introduction to the deck, you've actually got to learn a lot of the fundamentals that take a long time to learn for most people. If you're just using this deck to find out how to combat this deck, that's totally fine. I'm glad I still got to help someone. The big takeaways are how to block correctly, resource management, pitch stacking, and matchup knowledge. If you ever want to get a hold of me or talk to me about any of this stuff, my YouTube is SiphonTCG, where you're watching right now. My Twitter is also at SiphonTCG, and you can find me in Discord at Siphon4712. Some credit to be given to anyone that helped or gave inspiration for this deck is going to be Jacob Ball and TCG Gaming on Twitter. Discord users Pew Pew for 2, Slipstream, and the Techno Foundry. The global Discord from Flesh and Blood has also been a massive help. And anyone from my home LGS at Total Game Experience in Chillicothe, Ohio. If I've either discussed the deck with you or played against you with this deck, thank you for the reps, and you guys have been just a big help, even if you didn't know you were. Thank you guys for watching. If you guys are on YouTube, make sure you guys like, favorite, and subscribe. Comment down below. Your feedback is always appreciated. I look forward to reading the comment section of what you guys think about this guide. If you guys want to see more guides like this, again, let me know. I actually am working on one already for a hero that I will not announce, but I would like the feedback from this guide so I know how to better improve the next guide. This has been your boy Siphon from Siphon TCG. I'll see you guys next time.